Good morning, and welcome to the Lennox M. Reed Seminar. I'm Dr. Tracy Wheaton, President and CEO at Neuhaus Education Center. Neuhaus is a nonprofit educational foundation dedicated to promoting reading success. For over 40 years, Neuhaus has been a proven resource for professional learning and structured literacy by providing evidence-based training and support to teachers, supplying information and resources to families, and offering literacy services to adult learners. On behalf of the Neuhaus Board of Trustees, Advisory Board, and our staff, thank you for joining us. This annual event honors Lennox M. Reed, our founding director, who led the center for over 20 years. Lennox continues to remain a vital part of the center, serving as a member of our advisory board and alumni council. Much of the center's success, including financial stability, is owed to Lennox's vision, wisdom, dedication, and vitality. We would like to extend our gratitude to Graham and Edward Neuhaus for underwriting this event. We hope you enjoy today's speaker.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm Allison Peck, Vice President of Teacher Professional Learning at Neuhaus Education Center. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to provide instructions for submitting questions during this seminar. Please email your questions to events@neuhaus.org, and that's NEUHAUS.org, at any time throughout the presentation. Dr. Shanahan will pause throughout his segment to address questions. Certificates for continuing education units will be emailed to you on Monday using the name and email address you used to log into this presentation. We are tracking viewership, so it's important that you keep this window open to receive credit. Now it's time to hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Timothy Shanahan. Timothy Shanahan is a Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Previously, he was Director of Reading for the Chicago Public Schools. He is the author or editor of more than 200 publications on literacy education. Professor Shanahan is past president of the International Literacy Association. He served on the advisory board of the National Institute for Literacy under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He took a leadership role on the National Reading Panel and chaired 2 other federal research review panels: the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth, and the National Early Literacy Panel. Shanahan received the William S. Gray Citation for Lifetime Achievement and the Albert J. Harris Award for Outstanding Research on Reading Disability from the International Reading Association, and the P. David Pearson Award for Scholarly Influence from the Literacy Research Association. He was inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame in 2007 and is a former first grade teacher. We are humbled and honored to have him speak with us today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tim Shanahan, and I'm happy to be here. We were all supposed to be together today, but obviously concerns for everybody's health is most important. Today's sermon is about teaching students to read with complex text, which is a topic that has been ignored for far too long. As you can see, I've got a website listed there. If you're interested in having the slides to this talk, they are posted on my website in the publications section. Should be able to find them there. With that, let me just jump into this. About 10 years ago now, a number of states, more than 40 states, adopted standards that established difficulty levels of text that students were supposed to be able to handle by particular grade levels. This was really a revolutionary thing to do because historically, since states had set educational standards, no state had ever done this. In the past, essentially, reading was considered and treated as a developmental process that, frankly, kids were going to learn and develop across at their own rates, and that instruction wasn't going to have very much to do with that. And it sort of gave schools a free pass that, you could essentially say, well, Jimmy doesn't have to read like a fifth grader because he just doesn't read that well, or he doesn't learn that well. The surveys have been showing, however, that despite the fact that a number of states have set this as a standard, most teachers aren't really honoring it. Folks aren't following what's been asked for. And what that means is this standard that's really aimed at trying to raise students' reading achievement is being neglected. And I think that's a big mistake. I'm going to suggest that we really need to even rethink how we conceptualize reading, what it is that we think we're teaching, what it is that we think our children are learning. In really ever since tests have played such a big role in accountability in our schools, there has been a marked shift towards treating comprehension questions as skills to be taught. And so we can ask main idea questions. So we will do things like teach students to try to answer main idea questions. If identifying details is considered to be an important, comprehension skill, then we teach that. If kids are supposed to compare information, the fact is, when we've done studies on these skills, what we keep finding is that, in fact, they don't really exist. They're not measurable. They're not really teachable for the most part. Focusing on them, emphasizing them actually hasn't helped kids. And so lots of practice with those kinds of skills isn't making kids better readers, and therefore they shouldn't be the emphasis of instruction. The way I say it on the slide makes great sense. Reading comprehension is not the ability to answer certain kinds of text questions. What is it? It's the ability to make sense of the ideas expressed in text. It's the ability to negotiate the linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances of a text. Let me break that down a little bit just to make it as understandable as I can. Every text is an author's attempt to communicate information to some audience. And they might be trying to do it to entertain them, to inform them, to spur them on to some kind of action or to explain something, but they're always trying to communicate with an audience. And they make choices in developing that text. They pick certain words. They write their sentences certain ways. They lay out the information in the ways that they think will be most understandable or most effective towards their purpose. And some of those are what I would call affordances. Some of those things that they build into their text, they're affordances in the sense that they give us a leg up. And so I often think of an author who I've read a lot, and John Updike. John Updike is a writer who's known for his diction, for his word choice. It's almost perfect. And so when he describes a scene, you can see it. It's such a visual description. Not surprising that Updike studied to be an artist. He wanted to paint and draw, and actually his goal in life was to be a Disney animator. Instead, he became a Pulitzer Prize winning author. But he describes things so precisely, you can really see it, and that helps your comprehension. That's an affordance. But every single affordance that an author might put in a text is a potential barrier for some reader, some learner. And so, for example, if you're reading Updike and he gives one of these descriptions that I just talked about, and he chooses words that you don't know, that aren't in your vocabulary, aren't in your lexicon, all of a sudden that affordance that was so terrific becomes a barrier that somehow the reader has to find a way to get through or over or around. And so every reading act is this attempt to make sense of the ideas in the text, and we accomplish that by negotiating those affordances and barriers, taking advantage of them, solving them when they become problems to us. And I think that's how we need to look at what reading is And if that's what reading is, then reading instruction has to facilitate that process. It's not about knowing how to answer certain kinds of questions. It's about knowing how to make sense of a text. Now, what do teachers usually do? Now, this, I want to make a distinction here. This slide is not based on research. This is based on my own observations in classrooms over a career that goes back more than 50 years at this point. When teachers are trying to present a text to students, trying to get students to learn something, gain some information from a text, like in a social studies class or a science class, what they do when that text proves difficult for the students is they really tend to have four go-tos. One of them is the one that, frankly, we've told people to do for generations now, and that I want to talk a bit more about in a few moments. The idea has been basically, if a text is hard for a student, you need to move them to an easier text. So if you have a fifth grader who reads like a third grader, we're not going to let them read the fifth grade text. We'll put them in a third grade text. As I say, I'm not going to go into that right yet, but just think about it for a moment. If our goal is to teach students to read the fifth grade text, working in the third grade text probably isn't going to make that happen. Okay, we'll come back. A second approach that a lot of teachers take when kids have difficulty with the text is to read the text to the students. You know, we can take away that barrier of reading and make the information of this text available to you. If the school has sent out a memo, to the teachers saying, please, read this to the boys and girls about, what they need to do during the tornado drill or something like that. Maybe there's a health and safety issue here. Reading the text to the boys and girls might make great sense. We're not going to allow their reading to make them unsafe in this case. But in teaching, if you read the information to the students that they're supposed to read, you're not increasing their ability to read. And this is obvious at any level. I've seen primary grade teachers do this. Oh, they're going to have trouble with their reading book, so I'll just read the story to them and they can answer the questions. We'll do listening comprehension instead of reading comprehension. We still don't have any studies showing that if you improve somebody's listening comprehension, you make them a better reader. And so that doesn't quite get us there. A second point on that is, let's think of older students. If you're a ninth grader and say you're taking biology and the teacher says, gee, the boys and girls are going to have trouble reading the textbook, therefore I will just explain the information to them. I won't have them read the textbook. Do you really believe that they're going to handle their textbook in chemistry better because of that? And if you do that in both in biology and chemistry, and then you follow it up in physics and so on, when those boys and girls try to go to college, how do you think they're going to do in their physical science 101 class? And so this notion of we'll read it to them or they can hear it instead of reading, that might be a useful thing to something like an accommodation on a test. Gee, we want to test to see how much social studies the kids know. Therefore, we're going to allow the teacher, to read the test to the kids so that they can show what they know. I don't have any problem with that. But if the boys and girls are supposed to be learning to read that kind of text, that's an accommodation that will prevent learning, not make the student better enabled to succeed in life. A third kind of issue is telling students what the text says. You don't need to read this, boys and girls. I'll read it for you and we'll move on. And of course, there's the old-fashioned way that you just ignore the problem altogether. You assign the text. If the boys and girls can read it, that's fine. When you do the class discussion, the teacher will call on Statue of Liberty girl, the one whose arm is always up in the harbor. And, those boys and girls who didn't get it, not my problem. I hope it's obvious to everybody that, is listening to this that moving kids to an easier text, reading that text to the kids, telling them what it says, or simply ignoring the problem, none of those make kids better readers. None of those are going to give these kids better lives. And so we've got to come up with something better. And I would argue that better thing is teaching boys and girls how to comprehend, how to negotiate the difficulties of text. That said, I want to go back to this issue of teaching boys and girls at their levels. Matching the text the way that we're supposed to, or we've been told we're supposed to. This idea is actually a very old one. It was only really written about formally and in a way that influenced the field deeply in the 1940s, so 70, 80 years ago. But I've found, just recently, I found an article written in 1918, the last time we had a pandemic, 1918, and it was a survey of teachers in one of our states. And what it was, they were asking the teachers how they taught reading. And more than 50% of the teachers in 1918 were saying that when it came to reading, they taught with multiple books, and they had the boys and girls in books at their levels. Now, different people came up with odd schemes for placing kids in books. We don't really know how they did that kind of thing, but we know that they had it in their head that kids had to be matched to a book in a particular way, even if they didn't have a real good system for doing that. That changes in the 1940s when a big reading guru by the name of Emmett Betts writes what becomes the textbook of his generation. And what Betts says is that all readers have three levels. They have an independent level, they have an instructional level, they have a frustration level. Independent level means that this is a text that's easy enough for this student that they could read it on their own, they could learn from it on their own, they wouldn't need any assistance. Instructional level, these books are a bit harder. The students are going to make some mistakes with these. And in fact, if they have the support of a teacher who's doing the right things, they're going to be able to learn from this kind of text. They'll be able to become better readers if they work with that. And frustration level, frankly, are even harder texts, and they're considered to be so hard that if you were to place boys and girls in those texts and had the teacher working with them, it wouldn't matter. The kids wouldn't learn from those because it would just simply be too hard. It would be overwhelming. Betts went further than that. He said the way you figure this out is you test students, you try them out with the passages from these books or passages at these levels, and you have the kids read these passages aloud and answer questions about them. If the youngster can read 95 to 98% of the words, that is, like if you gave them a 100-word passage, they'd make 5 or fewer errors, orally. And if you ask them questions, they could answer 75 to 89% of the questions. And Betts said that was the instructional level. If you taught kids at that level, they would do better. That would be the optimum. They would learn the most. And kids placed in harder texts or easier texts would either have not very much to learn if they were in the easier ones, or they'd frankly be so frustrated in the harder ones that no learning would take place anyway. Betts claimed that they had research on this and found that this was the optimum way to place students. I wonder how many people in the audience are aware of the fact that in reading education, in special education, and in second language education, this notion of there being an instructional level that you have to match people to if they're going to make learning gains is gospel. It has been, handed down from the mountain for over 70 years now. Every teacher in America pretty much is trained when they're becoming a teacher to teach in these ways. And I wonder if you know all those things, are you aware of the fact that even though Betts said he'd done research showing that this was the optimum way to place students and this led to the greatest amount of learning, would it bother any of you to find out that in fact that study was never done? Let's talk about that. There are some research studies, and I want to talk about those research studies before I open this up the first time for questions. I'm going to do two things in the rest of my talk. I want to go through the research, and I want to give you some practical examples and practical advice on addressing these in the classroom, and if you're working with children in your own home, for them as well. But let's talk about the research first. Let's make sure that there's science behind what I'm saying and that I'm not just going off on my own here. And I want to go to that very first study, that 1942 Kilgallen study. Kilgallen was a doctoral student of Emmett Betts during World War II, and the study cited in his textbook was this Kilgallen study. It was his unpublished doctoral dissertation. As a teacher, I had been trained to teach kids at their instructional level. I taught boys and girls at their instructional level. I tested everybody one-on-one. I grouped my kids. I had all the different little books and so on. And I thought that was why people thought I was a good teacher. When I started working on my own doctorate and you know, became a professor, I got the opportunity to actually read this Kilgallen study, and I was shocked. Because in fact, Kilgallen study, they didn't teach anybody anything. They didn't place anybody in any kind of books. They took a small group of fourth graders and they had them read some text aloud and answer questions about it. So they took those measurements that Betts talked about. And what they were looking for was how many oral reading mistakes the boys and girls could make and still comprehend at that 75 to 89% level. And that was where that 95 to 98% came from. Those group of fourth graders, when they made, you know, 2 to 5 oral reading mistakes, they could still get that 85 to 89%, 75 to 89% comprehension, but they couldn't, they started to fall below that when they made more oral reading mistakes. And so that's how they came up with it. They never tried it out, you know, under study at all. Later on, in fact, years later, they were interviewed and asked, where did the 75 to 89% idea come from? And they couldn't remember. They assumed it was just something they'd made up for use in their own clinic, and that was it. So these are really made up numbers, and we've been doing something that doesn't necessarily work for kids. Well, there have been studies since then, so let's look at those quickly. Powell was a professor in Florida. Powell was a big believer in the idea of instructional level. He just thought that they had gotten it wrong. He thought that the texts that they were placing kids in were too easy, essentially the concept was right, the numbers were wrong. So Powell I've got one study cited here. He actually did several. He tested boys and girls first through 8th grade in a series of studies. And what he did exactly the same kind of study Kilgallen did. He was just interested in the match of oral reading to reading comprehension. And Powell found two things. One thing he found was that there wasn't a single instructional level, if you did it that way, that boys and girls at different grade levels seemed to be able to tolerate more disfluency and still comprehend well, and that therefore you would put kids in what would be harder books at some levels than at others. So there were many instructional levels, not a single one. And the second thing he found was that students could tolerate a considerable amount of disfluency and still comprehend reasonably well in many instances. And so he came up, with his own, scheme for placing kids, which he also didn't validate or actually try out. So Powell, concluded they were putting kids in books that are too easy. Dunkeld was a study of Powell's, and Dunkeld, in fact, never published this study. It was his doctoral dissertation. Powell wrote it up later for publication. It's never been cited in the field, unfortunately. What Dunkeld did is he went out, he went to second grade classrooms. He looked at how the teachers were placing boys and girls in the books, how they matched them to the books. So he knew that, say little Timmy was going to be working in, a book at the second grade level, and little Bobby was going to be working in a book at the first grade level. And what he did is he tested the kids at the beginning of the year, and he tested them again at the end of the year to see how much growth they made. And he wanted to see how much he could connect that to how accurately or how appropriately the kids had been placed at the beginning of the year. And what he found was that the boys and girls who learned the most during the year, who made the biggest gains in reading, weren't placed in that 95 to 98% fluency range. They weren't placed in the 75 to 89% comprehension range. They were boys and girls whose fluency with those beginning texts that they worked with at the beginning of second grade were like, they were making 15 and 18 mistakes per 100 words. They were like down in the 80 to 85% range. And their reading comprehension at the beginning of the year in those texts was below 50%. They were clearly, according to Betts and according to pretty much every scheme since then, they were clearly at frustration level, but those were the kids who actually made the biggest learning gains when they were placed like that. And the kids who were placed in relatively easier texts didn't learn as much. Jorgensen did a very similar study with third, fourth, and fifth graders and found that those book placements weren't making any sense. McNamara did a study with middle school students where she found that the kids who were intentionally placed in texts that were supposedly too hard for them actually learned more from those texts than the kids who were placed in the texts that were relatively easy, that somehow the harder texts engaged the kids to try to make sense of the ideas more. But it's not until 2000 that we actually get an experiment where somebody says, let's evaluate this. Let's really try it out and see if it works. And so what Morgan and her colleagues do is they identify a bunch of second graders, second grade classrooms. They go in and they test the boys and girls at the beginning of the year. They find their instructional level according to the Betts criteria. And they randomly assign these boys and girls to one of three treatment groups. Treatment group one gets placed at their instructional level. They're going to be put in texts. They're going to work with texts that they can read with 95 to 98% accuracy and 75 to 89% comprehension. If the books are harder than that, too bad, but that's what they're going to work with. The kids in the second group, in that they're randomly assigned to, they're just like the first kids, but they're going to be placed in books that are 2 grade levels above their supposed instructional level. And the third group is going to get placed 4 grade levels above. So if you're a kid and you read at the second grade level in that study, if you get picked for the first group, you read in a second grade book. If you get picked for the second group, you get put in a 4th grade book. And if you're in that third group, you work at a 6th grade book. So we know how this is supposed to come out. The boys and girls in the first group are supposed to learn the most. The kids in the second group are probably going to learn something, but nowhere near as much as the first group because they're at a frustration level. And those kids in that third group, frankly, they're going to be so frustrated and so angry. They're going to burn the school down. They're not just going to not learn. They're going to act out and be behavior problems and be terrible kids. And we know the story. They do this for a year. They come back and test the boys and girls at the end of the school year. What they found was all the groups made some progress during the year. They all learned something. But the boys and girls in the first group, in the instructional level group, learned less than anybody else. They made the lowest reading gains. The kids in the next group outperformed them by almost a full school year in reading performance. And the kids in that third group that I said were going to be such a disaster, they didn't do as well as the middle group, but they certainly outperformed that instructional level group. The authors concluded that the reason for the superiority of being in the harder text was opportunity to learn. Like me, they buy the notion that kids are learning how to handle text and the language of text and the construction, the structure of text and those kinds of things. And that if you're working in texts that are relatively easy for you, that you can frankly already read pretty well, there's not much for you to learn. The school has gone out of its way to make sure they don't teach you very much. Let me go a little farther with the research. Looks like there's a lot here, but this will go fast. Brown replicated that Morgan study with third graders, found the same thing. A study or pair of studies probably of interest to many of the people on this call, done by O'Connor. O'Connor is a special educator. She studies kids who have IEPs. She studies learning disabled kids. She did a couple of really interesting studies, one that's cited a lot, one that gets ignored. Now, the one that's cited a lot is she had some problems with the study. There are a few messy parts to it that some of my colleagues, someone like Marilyn Adams would say, you just have to throw that study out altogether, but I'm not going to do that. I'm I'm going to try to keep it in for the moment. What O'Connor did is, again, an experiment. She took a bunch of boys and girls who were learning disabled. All of these kids had IEPs. They were in 3rd through 5th grade. She tells us in the study that the highest readers of these children were reading at beginning 2nd grade levels. Everybody was at either that level or below. So they might have been non-readers. They could have been any place on that continuum. But the best 2nd grade levels, so kids were at least a year behind, and some kids, 2 and 3 years behind. It's going to be a tutoring study. The kids are going to get tutored in phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and reading comprehension, all one-on-one tutoring. Okay, experiment. She's going to randomly assign kids to one of 3 groups. One group's a control group. They're going to get no extra tutoring, just their regular classroom work. So that's what happens to those kids. The other 2 groups are going to get tutored. In one group, you get tutored at your reading level. At the other group, you get tutored at your grade level. So if you're a 3rd grader who reads like a 2nd grader, if you get placed in the 1st group, you're going to be in a 2nd grade book. If you get placed in the 2nd group, you'd work in a 3rd grade book. That's the idea. They do this for some number of months. They come back, they test the boys and girls. They find something different than what Morgan and Brown found in their studies in regular classrooms. They found that indeed the boys and girls who were in the instructional level group, who worked at their reading level, not their grade level, made somewhat bigger gains in decoding and in word reading, not in comprehension, but in those important foundational skills, found that the kids did better if they were placed at their instructional level. She analyzed the data pretty closely. One of the things she tells us is the advantage was clearly with the lowest readers, the bottom half of her distribution, that they did better because of the instructional group. The kids in the top half, it didn't seem to make much difference for. I said there were some problems in the implementation of the study. I'm not going to get into those, but let's just pretend like it's a perfect study, and let's treat these data, with the respect that I think a lot of people accord them. O'Connor comes back several years later, and she says there was always something that bothered her about that study. She was a very careful researcher, and one of the things that she noticed in the study, it was a tutoring study, remember, she thought that there was a difference in how the teachers in the instructional level group responded to the oral reading errors of the children compared to what the people in the grade level groups did. Lots of different ways you can respond to reading errors. And she decided to redo the study, to go and get another group of kids, do everything I've told you, but with one difference. In this case, what she was going to do is go in and train all the teachers to respond in a consistent way to the students' oral reading errors so that everybody was teaching the same thing. When she did that, for the 2nd group, guess what? Absolutely no advantage to having those boys and girls taught with the instructional level materials. They did just as well as if they had been taught, when they were taught with the grade level materials. I shared that at an International Dyslexia Association meeting in Ohio, a state meeting where they had invited, it was an annual conference kind of thing, and they'd invited in not just educators, but they had parents there, which is very common in special ed meetings. And because they were honoring a number of students around the state, dyslexic students who were on the honor roll, or who were, being accepted to prestigious colleges and so on. They were giving them some kind of honors. And so my audience included not just teachers and principals and, school heads and so on, but also high school kids. And when I got to this point, when I talked about O'Connor's studies and finding that there was no learning advantage to placing kids in these instructional texts, a part of the audience burst out in cheers. Cheers. When it was over, I made a beeline. I wanted to know what happened, because usually my speeches don't get cheers in the middle. And so we grouped up, and it was this group of boys and girls, these high school kids. And what they said is, what you're saying is we don't need to work in the stupid books anymore. Because for these boys and girls, they were looking and saying, if there's no educational reason, if there's no learning benefit for putting me in that easier text, why are you cutting me off intellectually from the things that I'm curious about and that I'm capable of understanding? Why are you cutting me off from the social group that I want to affiliate with if there's no benefit? Kind of an interesting thing. These last three studies are just more of the same. The teaching kids at their instructional level gives no benefit. The Kuhn study actually compares guided reading, the Thonis and Pinnell approach where you put everybody at their instructional level, versus their fluency-oriented instruction where everybody's taught at their grade level. And they move these second and third graders, way ahead of the kids who had been placed at instructional level and so on. What I'm telling you is every single study that we have finds one of two things. Either placing boys and girls at the instructional level is making no difference, it's giving no benefit, or it's actually doing harm. It's holding our boys and girls back, and it's preventing them from learning, or preventing them from learning as much as they possibly could. Having said that, let me just set this up, and then I'm going to ask Haley for whatever questions. So Haley, be ready. What I'm telling you folks is that our boys and girls can learn from difficult text, but we can't just throw them into the text. And that's really where we're going to go after we take a few questions or see what's come in. So Haley, what do we have, if anything?
Thank you, Dr. Shanahan, for that great presentation on teaching with complex types. Hi, I'm Haley Hunt. I'm the Associate Vice President of Professional Learning at Neuhaus. And let's relay some of the questions we have learned so far. So Dr. Shanahan, is your thesis applicable for all students, including dyslexic students? I know you just spoke about that a little bit. Or do we find it's just for our typical readers?
It's not for all students, or it's not for all situations, but dyslexia isn't the issue here. And so, no, it's not just for the average, regular, reader. It's also for those youngsters who are, that either we know to be or suspect to be, suffering from dyslexia or reading disability, whatever the terminology. The exceptions, and I think I have a slide on it, but let's take it right now because it's such an important question. Let's think for a moment about what makes text very difficult for kids to read, say initially in kindergarten, first grade. What is it that's blocking them? And I think you're going to find it's not the word meanings that are getting in their ways. It's not the sentence construction. It's not the structure of the text. It's not the cohesion. It's not, they have trouble making sense of scientific definitions, or they can't read the graphics. Those will become problems for them when they start confronting those. But the problem for beginning readers is decoding. That's the text barrier that they have to deal with. And so what would it mean to put a beginning reader, somebody who's learning the basics of decoding, what would it mean to them to be thrown in a harder text? And what it would mean is you would throw them into text with less word repetition, less spelling pattern repetition, less real opportunity to master those elements of our decoding system. And so, no, absolutely not. With beginning readers, I would not throw them into hard text. In fact, this notion of there being an instructional level probably makes sense for a year or two as kids are getting that basic decoding down. Not, in the entire system, but what you'd expect, say, that average reader or that good reader to have by, say, the end of first grade. Because remember, all these studies done with second graders were finding, hey, this was really beneficial to these kids. When anyone breaks the data out, what they keep finding is, yeah, but those kids, those really low kids, who are not decoding English at this stage, this doesn't seem to be facilitated for them. And so I would definitely put kids in text where the challenges are making sense of our decoding system initially. And once they, as I say, can do that as well as, say, a typical average first grader at the end of the year, or beginning second grader at the beginning of that year, then it's okay. Then you can start moving kids into texts that are at their grade level or that are above what we've traditionally called an instructional level. And I think what we're seeing is benefits even for those boys and girls with learning problems. So, but they need teaching, and that's what we're going to get to. So don't take this as he's just saying throw them in something that they're going to struggle with. That's not the point. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to throw them into things where there's a real opportunity for them to learn, and then we want to make sure that opportunity is taken advantage of. Good question.
Great. We have another. What advice would you give to parents who are concerned about their child's reading ability?
Well, this is going to depend at sort of what ages that's happening, or more importantly, how proficient the kids are. Certainly, if you suspect that your youngster is having trouble reading, first thing, doesn't always work, and I know there are legions of complaints and concerns, but the first thing to do is get in touch with your child's teacher and talk to her about it. See what she knows. In some cases, teachers will give wonderful advice there and support, and will be able to tell you what's going on. Sadly, there'll be other cases where teachers will do things like say, "Oh, don't worry about his reading. He'll mature into it," and so on. That kind of stuff you just have to kind of work around. Unfortunately, not all of our teachers are as trained as they need to be, as educated as they need to be about these issues. We have a job to do there, but certainly talk to the school first and to see what they can provide, what they know about the issue and the problem. Beyond that, you can obviously seek assistance outside the school. There are special schools, private schools that deal with this. There are psychologists that, for a fee will, test your children if you're not getting the testing that you think you need at the school. Some parents are in a great position to do some teaching of reading to their children themselves, and they can get involved in that. In other cases, the parent is the worst person to do it because of the relationship between parent and child, and I see that in my own family, that, a youngster who is extremely teachable, but won't sit down with mom for whatever reason, it changes that relationship. But do not, if you suspect your youngster is having trouble, don't just sit on it and say, "Oh, I'm sure the school will tell me if there's a problem." That isn't necessarily the case. So be vigilant about it, follow it up, and get as involved in it as you can productively do.
Okay, here's another. When you say learning gains when referring to Dunkel's study, do you mean actual knowledge and strategies to overcome the barriers they may encounter when reading, and therefore frustration level has moved? And how do we measure the learning gains?
In that study, they measured it by the level of text that the students were able to read with comprehension and accuracy. So, an informal reading inventory, which means that, the student really did move in those. You raised the frustration level, essentially. I'm terrible about this because on this assessment question, because frankly, I'm usually willing to accept a pretty wide range of assessments, and a lot of people want something very specific. I want, however it's measured, whether you use a standardized test, and there are a legion of those that can be quite good, whether we look at something like your state tests that are given to kids 3rd grade and up, and so on, those kinds of tests, or whether you use less formal measures like informal reading inventories and such. What we want to see is that the youngster is able to handle progressively more difficult text. That the way a parent would see it is, if you got some books that had levels put on them, and that's easy these days because there are things like the Lexile system where that stuff is online, and you can find hundreds of books and thousands of books that they've Lexiled. Publishers often put those figures out, libraries often put those figures out, so parents can find material at different levels. See what your child is capable of reading with understanding. So it could be very formal, it could be very informal. In these various studies, they were either standardized tests, or they were things like informal inventories that they standardized the testing procedures for. So Yeah, in that Dunkeld study, the kids were really reading harder text. And with that, Haley, let's hold questions. Let's get back into this. I'll come back to you, I promise. And if you have more questions, send them in. We'll get to the ones we can. Let's get into this idea of not just throwing kids into difficult text. The traditional instructional level theory that me and thousands, millions of other educators in the last 70 years had bought into was that learning is facilitated by putting students in text that they could read with reasonably good fluency and comprehension, and then they would move up in really small incremental steps. If you know almost all the words and you can make sense of everything in this kind of text, there's not a lot to learn. But the key was you had to figure out what the youngster's reading level was, so you test the child somehow, and you needed to find out how hard the text was, so you'd come up with some text leveling system. And you had to bring those into the proper stasis. They had to be matched appropriately, and then learning would be better. That's the traditional view of this. I mentioned Powell earlier, and Powell was one of the first American educators to get into to Vygotsky's work. So he was very Vygotsky-ish. Essentially, he was in the difficult situation of how do you explain that this isn't a 2-variable problem, the student in the text is a 3-variable problem. Essentially, the way he explained it is, yes, you needed to know what the reader's level was. So, Betts wasn't wrong about that. 2, you had to know how hard the text was that you were going to teach with. No question there. We have to have those lined up somehow. But the third item in the equation, according to him, being a Vygotsky guy, was mediation. Now, I'm not a Vygotsky guy, so I'll say there's a teacher. These kids aren't put in school with the idea that they're going to teach themselves to read. They're there with the idea that we've hired adults who are going to help in that process. They're going to make that work. And so it's okay to put a youngster in a text they can't already read, because there's somebody there who's going to do things like tell them what some of the words are, or ask them to reread something, or who's going to say, I don't think you got that. Let's look at it again. They're not going to just, oh, well, I guess you don't get it. That might be true if you're working on your own, but usually our boys and girls aren't. There's a teacher there, and usually a darn good one. And so those teachers, instead of being there to sort of watch your kids figure the system out, should really be there putting real barriers in front of kids and then teaching them how to get over those barriers and through those barriers. Here's that answer to that earlier question, just so you see that it really is here. The standards, if you look at those state standards that I said set reading levels, they do that 2nd grade through 12th grade in the states that have done that. And those aren't all Common Core states, just so you know. Even states that aren't on Common Core have set those kinds of levels. And textbook companies have really moved their products to match these higher levels, these grade level levels. It's certainly a good idea. Here's an idea I didn't say earlier. It's a good idea to read complex text to young kids, to read text that those boys and girls wouldn't be able to decode themselves. But young children need to learn to decode, and more complex text can actually interfere with that. And so we use relatively easy text, initially easy and linguistically, easy conceptually, but not easy for the children in terms of the spelling patterns and stuff, because that's what they're learning to deal with. You have to show them enough of that they can actually learn it. So, okay. Here I have a list of studies, and I don't plan on talking about these individually at all. But every one of these studies has done something, and most of these actually were done in special education with children with learning problems. Not all, but almost all. Essentially, what they did in every one of these studies is they intentionally place students in text at their frustration level. They intentionally do that. So it's not, oh, we know they're going to learn from it. They intentionally put them in frustration level text. And then they provide one or more scaffolds. They're studying the scaffolds, actually. The most obvious one I've already mentioned, and so I might as well hit it again, vocabulary. The most obvious difference between a reader and a text is the text uses some words that you don't know the meaning of. So what have we done about that historically? We pre-teach or introduce some of the words that we think the kids aren't going to know to make the text more familiar to them. In other words, if the text is really hard and the kids aren't coming up to that level, could we artificially make it as if they are by matching their vocabulary a little bit to what's in the text? Does it work? Studies like these say, in fact, it does work. That introducing some of that vocabulary ahead of time raises the difficulty level that kids can handle in the text. And so that scaffold actually makes the text more at the kids' instructional level, even though we know it's at their frustration level. And there are other scaffolds as well. On these studies, some of them study a particular scaffold, some of them have 2 or 3 different scaffolds that they pursue. But in every one of these cases, they find, again, that if you put kids in frustration level materials and then you scaffold in one or more ways, their ability to handle that text goes up. And in fact, in some of the studies, it goes all the way up to an instructional level. I would suggest an instructional level isn't how the youngster matches to the text, but we end up going back to that 3 variable notion. It's how well the child matches that text given the amount of support that the teacher is willing to provide and able to provide. And I said all those studies did such a thing. These 2. There's a lot of research on this. And again, most of that with kids with learning problems. So can this work? Yes. Does this work? Yes. Are we doing it? Usually not. And when we are doing it, when we're putting kids in texts that are too hard for them, we're usually doing it just sort of, gee, there's nothing else I can do. That's the social studies book that we have. I don't know what to do with that. I think we need to start teaching our teachers how to scaffold these things successfully as we're done in these studies. And I think that that's what we should be doing the rest of our time together this afternoon is let's look practically. Now, I've got a list here of some of the features of text and ideas that can make text difficult. I'm not going through all of these today, and this is not, please, everyone understand, this is not everything that can make a text difficult. Think of your own reading experiences. Anytime you've had trouble understanding something that you were reading, that is a potential issue that could be scaffolded and kids could learn how to handle. So I'm going to go through some of the bigger ones, some of the ones that have a lot of research behind them, and I'm going to, we'll just have to leave the others for some other time. Let's start out with vocabulary. I've already given this one away in the sense that pre-teaching or pre-introducing vocabulary before the boys and girls have to confront it in the text improves the kids' ability to handle that text. That's been found in a number of studies. It's pretty straightforward and it makes sense. I'm going to suggest, however, that as teachers, we often do this one badly. And textbook publishers, many of whom I've worked with over the years, do this badly. And so we need to think through, what does it really mean to help kids with this particular barrier? I think that's what we haven't done. We haven't thought very deeply about that. So let me give some examples. And I've lifted a 4th grade text here. It doesn't matter whose 4th grade text it is. I think it's characteristic. It's science text, but it could be in a reading book. It could be in a science book in 4th grade. Photosynthesis may sound like a big word, but it's actually pretty simple. You can divide it into 2 parts. Photo is the Greek word for light. Synthesis is the Greek word for putting together, which explains what photosynthesis is. It's using light to put things together. You may have noticed that all animals and humans eat food, but plants don't eat anything. Photosynthesis is how plants eat, and it goes on to explain how the plants transform light into their nutrition. If we were together, I would be asking you as an audience to make a guess as to, what words would the publisher suggest you pre-teach. I bet you could make a pretty good guess. Let me show you what they recommend. Photosynthesis. And I'm going to suggest to you that photosynthesis is a word that in this particular text, I would not pre-teach. I would argue that's a really bad choice. And I think it might be obvious to you, but let me, just in case. The reason photosynthesis is a bad choice is because the text is going to tell you what photosynthesis is. The point of reading this is to make sense of the scientific definition that they're going to provide to 9-year-olds about photosynthesis. What the barrier in this text isn't knowing the word photosynthesis, it's making sense of the definition as provided here. And so what I would suggest that you do is not pre-teach photosynthesis for this text. Kids are just going to have to deal with that. And I know there must be some mothers out there going, but my youngster, has some reading problems. He might not be able to pronounce that right. Let's not worry about that right now. Let's let them try to make sense of it, because to understand photosynthesis, you have to read this text. If I tell them what photosynthesis is ahead of time, I've just made the text irrelevant. The youngster, and in fact, what we're seeing in schools more and more is kids are waiting teachers out. Teacher tells me what photosynthesis is and then asks us to read this page or this section. I'll sit here and turn pages and pretend to read. And then when the questions start and she says, what's photosynthesis? I'll say, that's how plants eat. How did I know it? I didn't know it because I read it. I know it because the teacher told me, and I don't have to read it all in her class. That's not a good idea. So my rule is, if the author is going to define the word, I'm not going to pre-teach that word. If there's any word in the definition that I think the kids aren't going to understand, fair game. If there are words the teacher's going to use, the text is going to use to explain the concept that you don't think the kids are going to understand, just fine. Gee, I don't think the kids are going to know why they're talking about Greek words here. Maybe I'll tell them that Greek words, a lot of Greek words are where we've built a lot of English words from. And so if you know a little bit about Greek, it'll help you understand English words. You can do that. That's just fine. But photosynthesis is the point being explained here, and telling kids the point, telling them what it says before they read it, doesn't help them read. It gets in the way of that reading. It keeps them from reading. So I'd put that one out of bounds. Another example. Some scientists argue that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. This is a 5th grade passage. This from a 5th grade book. This is the words that are highlighted were not highlighted by the publisher. I've highlighted them. It's clear that in at least the piece of text we have here, those 3 words are not defined at all in this part of the text. So it's certainly possible that the kids wouldn't know the meanings of what a glacier is or what it means to seep. But my question is, just looking at the text that's here, do you think the boys and girls, say in a 5th grade class, could figure out the meanings of any of those blue words if they didn't know them already? I think they could. And most teachers that I talk to around the country think they could. And so a word like glaciers, I'm not going to pre-teach it because I think they can figure it out from the text. How would they do it? Well, essentially what I'm suggesting to you is sort of the same thing I said about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis shouldn't be what I prepare kids. I'm not going to tell you what photosynthesis is before you read this. I'm going to make photosynthesis a comprehension question that I'm going to ask you once we finish it. And the same thing here, I'm not going to tell you what a glacier is. I'm not going to go in and pre-teach this, even if the publisher says to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have you read this text, and when you're done reading, I'm going to say, boys and girls, what's a glacier? If they're able to answer it, then they got it. They were able to figure it out. They used the context to make sense of the word, and that's what we want a reader to do. They took advantage of the affordance the author had built into the text. If they start flipping pages or looking at their shoes or waiting for the little girl whose hand is always up to answer it, then I'm not going to yell at them. I'm going to take them back to the text. We're going to go back to this and take a look at this sentence and see if we can figure it out. Gee, glaciers will melt. Does that give you any clues? And when they melt, the sea levels are going to rise. Does that tell you anything about them? And so the kids can actually start to figure this out. I don't think there's a commercial reading program on the market that doesn't have at least 3 or 4 lessons every year, usually around the middle of the year, about trying to figure out word meanings from context. I don't care whether you do those worksheets or not. What I would suggest to you is that every guided reading experience in your classrooms should be opportunities for you to check on whether the kids are using context to make sense of words. And if they're not, there are opportunities for you to teach boys and girls how to do that. Not just to get this word meaning, of course, but to apply those skills each time they read. I'd rather see you teaching that all year long than in the occasional skills lesson where we just focus on it. I'm going to skip this example. It's wonderful, but there's just a lot more for us to get into. I want to say one more thing about vocabulary, though, before I move on. This heading on here, I didn't make a mention of that. It says tell vocabulary. It doesn't say teach it. It doesn't say pre-teach it. It doesn't say master it. To teach kids vocabulary, it requires, considerable work, and I understand that, and we need to have time in our classrooms for that. To prepare a student to make sense of a text, they don't need deep knowledge of a word. They just need to be familiar with it. And so if I'm going to tell you what a glacier, glacier is a big piece of ice, and okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time going, who thinks they know what a glacier is? Who wants to guess? I did a study for the U.S. Department of Education a few years ago where we conducted observations in more than 1,000 preschool through third grade classes, 4 half days of observation on each room. And I can tell you that there's probably no more boring time than when teachers are pre-teaching the vocabulary. I have seen videos of 4-year-olds, when teacher says, oh, we're going to read this, and so let me, show you some of the words, and the kids are just, oh, here we go. The most world-weary 4-year-olds you've ever seen. If your youngsters are too young to read to do what I'm saying, or can't read the definitions, just tell them, glacier is a big piece of ice. Photosynthesis, how plants eat. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that. Just get kids ready for the reading. Or if they're able to read, let's say they are second grade and up, why not just, if there are 6 words here, or 10 words here, or 4 words here you want to pre-teach, why don't you just put those on the whiteboard, or put those on a printed glossary and say, kids, there's some words here I thought you're going to have trouble with in the text. I've just put together an alphabetical list of them here with some definitions. If you come to one of those words and you aren't sure what it means, it's on the paper. And if you hit some of the other words and you're not sure, raise your hand and I'll come and help you. How about something like that? And that takes away huge pieces of instructional time so that you can do the kinds of things I'm talking about. Let's move on from vocabulary. Comprehending sentences. Reading requires more than the ability to make sense of word meanings. Kids have to be able to detangle or make sense of the syntax in the sentences, how the sentences are constructed. I've got a 5th grade, a sentence I've pulled out of a 5th grade text. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. I'm guessing people who work with 5th graders can look at that, or maybe if you have a 5th grader at home, you can make your own judgment of whether you think that sentence might trip kids up or not. Why do I think it's hard? Well, it's 25 words long, so I know it's going to put some strain on memory. Usually, except in this kind of speechifying situation we're in today, lecturing situation, when we talk to each other, we tend to keep our utterances fairly short to stay within memory demands. And so 25 words says to me that might put some memory demands on a 10-year-old. There are 5 commas. That tells me that there are going to be a number of ideas in this sentence that are going to have to get stitched together somehow. There's also numbers. There are also an acronym. There are also parentheses. All of those complicate things a little bit. So it's a guess, but my guess is kids might have trouble with this. And so what would I do with it? Well, the first thing I would say to you is I wouldn't try to head off the problem like I might do with vocabulary. I'm not going to try to jump. I'm not going to pre-teach this sentence, for example. What I am going to do is I'm going to read the text that the boys and girls are going to be working with. And I'm going to try to identify those trouble spots. And this would be a trouble spot. I think the kids are going to have trouble understanding, making sense of this sentence. Therefore, I'm going to ask them about it. So I'll have them read it however I normally have them read it. If we read it a page at a time, when we've read this page, I'm going to ask a question that's going to reveal to me whether the boys and girls understood my sentence. I'm not going to point at the sentence. I'm just going to, just be one of the questions that I ask among others. If we read it section by section, or you read the whole thing at once, the question will just be one of the questions. In this case, I might ask a question like, what did the IAU do? Pretty straightforward. If the boys and girls can answer my question, this sentence wasn't as hard as I thought it was, and we can just move on. If they can't answer it, which is what I suspect will be the case, then I have something to teach. Now we have a way of strengthening the reader. We can show them what to do with this kind of sentence. The same way we want kids to be able to use context. We want kids to be able to use morphology to figure out unknown words. I don't want sentence complexity to just be an on-off switch. Well, I either understand it or I don't. There's nothing I can do about it. We need to teach kids what to do about it. And so how would I do that? Well, in this case, probably the first thing I would do is I'd ask if there's a verb in this sentence. Can anybody find a verb? Yeah, there it is. Number 23. The 23rd word in the sentence is the verb, made. Linguists tell us that when we make sense of a sentence, we do it from the verb out. You find the verb, you listen for the verb. You don't know you're doing this, but we've got studies showing that this is how people actually appear to process the information. You find that verb, and then you start connecting ideas to it. If there's anybody in the audience today that's a German speaker or a German reader, they know that in German, there are particular constructions where the verb is always at the end of the sentence, which means you have to hold everything in memory till you get to that word to process it, which makes it very difficult. English over the last 50 years has been changing. It's becoming much more like German. And what's happening is verbs are migrating to the right in sentences. They come later and later. And nobody's showing kids what to do with this. And so in science is the place it's happening most often. It's sort of leading the pack. And so I'm not terribly surprised that the 23rd word is a verb, but kids have to get used to trying to find the verb when they're reading this kind of sentence. So what else would I do with this? Well, one possibility would be to show the kids a breakdown of the sentence like this. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. That blue part is the subject. It just goes on and on and on. And then you get that poor little verb hidden. So we got to unpack that, got to find that. And then we can sort of, that blue part just is about the IAU, or it's about the International Astronomical Union. We don't have to have all that information all at once. We can pull it apart and make sense of it. If this bothers you, or you don't like this, maybe it reminds you of diagramming sentences when you were a kid, we can do it another way. Take them back to that sentence and let's read it and reread it and do intensive questioning. Who was the sentence about? Let's see if you can figure that out. Who was the IAU? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they do it? And actually guiding kids through that kind of a set of ideas. Another example, this one from 4th grade. The women of Montgomery, both young and older, would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet trimming, or something to make the ladies look festive. This is an award-winning book. It's well worth having 4th graders read a book like this. But this sentence is 44 words long. It has 2 commas and an em dash. And I'm going to bet that the typical 9-year-old, not just the kids with learning problems, but the typical 9-year-old is going to have trouble reading this sentence. What would we do with it? I've had teachers say to me, well, I'm not a linguist, so I wouldn't know how to break this down. The fact is, if you're a teacher, if you're an adult who can read reasonably well, you might not be aware of it, but you know a heck of a lot about language. And we have to start using what we know a little bit more. Would it help if you had some training in linguistics? I think it would be great. I'm for it 100%. But I've learned a few things about sentences over the years, just being a reader, just being a listener. And so one of the things I learned a long time ago is lots of time, if you have internal punctuation, like the commas in that first line of the sentence, a lot of times those are extra ideas. And if you just set those aside, you can make sense of the rest of the sentence. And so let me just, I'll do this electronically. I'm going to take away this both young and older, this part between the commas. It doesn't matter if I've read it or not. I'm just getting the part between the commas and I'm taking that away to see if things get better. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday set. For some kids, what I just did, I solved their problem, and then we can put this back, and they'll get the idea that these women, it wasn't just the older women, it was both of them. We can get that back too. But let's imagine that your youngsters this wasn't enough. They're still struggling with this. Where else can we break this sentence? And usually when I ask audiences, they come up with a couple of ideas, and they're both good. They both work. One is to go with the demonstrative pronouns. And I don't care if you know what demonstrative pronouns are, the that's and the whiches. And so as we see, their fancy holiday dresses, that needed adjustments, or their suits and blouses, that. We could break at those that's. I've taught myself to read a foreign language, and knowing where the that's and whiches, it makes a huge difference in making sense of the sentences. But another possibility on this one are the conjunctions, the ands and ors and buts, that kind of thing. And the reason is because there are a bunch of them here. And so, I'm going to break at that punctuation mark, but I broke at all these ors as well. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet trimming, or something to make the ladies look festive. And again, for some boys and girls, what I've done, I just solved their problem. It's all solved. It's, they understand the sentence now, and now they have a little bit more idea of things they could do to make sense of such sentences in the future, like next time we read. But let's say you have some second language kids in your classroom, and I know that in different places in the country, in Chicago, it was 25% of my boys and girls, so I'm pretty sure that some of you will have that. There's another thing that might be blocking them here. That a lot of those boys and girls won't have trouble with the first part of this. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. It's after these ors where it kind of falls apart. The independent clause, that's the part at the beginning that could stand as a sentence all by itself. You got to somehow figure out how to connect the rest of this stuff to it. And the way that we do that, the women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or the women of Montgomery would come in with their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch of flowers. Oh my goodness, now everybody's getting it. And so what you have to do, you experiment, you try things out, but it's just breaking the things down. Now I have another one of these examples, and I'm not going to do this one, but I wanted it here for a reason. I was doing a talk not for people who teach primary grade kids or elementary kids, but for people who teach beginning college students. And so I was actually supposed to be there talking about the ACT test that a lot of kids take to get into college. And I looked at some of the release texts of ACT. They always have 4 passages. And this is the very first sentence in one of the passages that they give to the boys and girls. It's 68 words long, has 7 commas or semicolons, parentheses, and typographic cues. I think there are a lot of kids who would try to read this sentence and go, I'm not going to college. They need to know how to break it down. And so what I've done here is built into the PowerPoint is I break this down on its punctuation. I then try to find the verbs. And unlike that 5th grade sentence I showed you, this one has a lot of verbs. And some of them had more than one verb in a line, so I broke those down too. And then I went through and made sure I knew who was saying each of these or doing each of these things. Tried to fill in who the subject were of those verbs, and got to the point where you could actually read that sentence and understand fully what it was trying to say. We don't have time to go through it, but you get the idea. We need to identify these kinds of sentences, give kids a chance to make sense of them. If they don't make sense of them, we need to show them how, and over time, they'll not only just understand the text, you help them with this, but you'll also help them, you'll get them farther than that. Let me show you, I want to show 2 more examples real fast, and then we'll kick it back to Haley. Cohesion is another aspect of text that we can facilitate. It's another potential barrier. I've lifted this example right out of the research. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Which of those do you think students find easier to comprehend? And if you guessed it's the second one, you're correct. See, the ideas in text, we don't just have a list of ideas, we stitch the ideas together. They have to connect to each other. And so we do that a number of ways. When it comes to nouns like this, we use repetition, like penguin, penguin in that second sentence. We use synonyms like penguin and prey in the first sentence. And we use pronouns like in both of these, penguin and it at the end of both of those sentences. Why are some of these harder than others? Because it's easier to understand a repetition than it is a synonym. And so showing kids how this kind of thing works. And so I've got an example of that here. Meanwhile, the nebula, this is 5th grade as well. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around the sun, around it, sorry. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun and coolest at its outer edge. As the disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. It pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. Imagine a group of 5th graders sitting down and reading that passage silently. And now the teacher asks a question like, what's the scientific process that's being described there, explained there? How many of the boys and girls are going to answer that question? And I would suggest a lot of them will struggle with it, not because the vocabulary is so hard and unfamiliar, not because the sentences are so complicated, but because the hard part here is stitching one idea together after another. And so let's help the boys and girls with that. What I would ask kids to do is to, and we do this usually as in partners, find the first scientific concept in this passage, the nebula, and find all the words that are used to refer to talk about the nebula. And maybe we'll underline those. And then I want them to find the second concept in the text, and this was one, sun. And again, we're going to find all the ones that are refer to the sun, and we're going to maybe circle those. And then I want to find the third concept. Maybe we'll put a box around all of these and their mentions, and so on all the way through the text. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the sun until the nebula formed a large flat ring around the sun. Scientists call this ring, this large flat ring, a protoplanetary disk. This large flat ring was hottest where the large flat ring was closest to the sun and the coolest at the large flat ring's outer edge. As the disk, that disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. The sun's gravity pulled at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas, until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. Showing kids how to make those connections, how to stitch those ideas together is an important part of reading instruction. And again, there are several examples. So I wanted to give you 2. Here's a list of places you can find more on all those examples. And these are all listed in my on my website. In fact, the articles are there. You can download them for free. I want to give one last example, and then I'm going to stop and turn this over to Haley. I know a lot of you have boys and girls who aren't just a little behind. When they're in 5th grade, they're not reading at a 4th grade level. Maybe they're not even reading at a 2nd grade level. Maybe they're reading at a 3rd grade level. Maybe they're reading at a 2nd grade level. Would I put that child into the 5th grade material? I would, but one of the scaffolds that I would add to it was we'd do our fluency work. We would try to read this text aloud and practice that before we did our comprehension work. In other words, we would, if I had a child who was 3 years behind in this example, and my other kids weren't, I would set up some way where this youngster is going to get an opportunity to read this text once or twice aloud ahead of time. And I don't care whether that's done with a teacher's aide, a special teacher, a peer, a tape recorder, a mom at home, however you can make it work. But essentially the youngster reads through it. Let's not worry about comprehension right now. Let's not worry about understanding it. Let's just resolve the words. Let's just make sure we can read it what you'll find is, what those studies found is, it raises the kids' ability to handle that text by 1 to 2 grade levels. The scaffolds I was showing you before are sufficient to pull kids 1 or 2 grade levels. And so essentially, not using this instead of those, but in addition to it, they're on the same level. They're working with the text in the same way the other boys and girls are. There are others in here that I've built in and other things to say, but why don't we stop that? I'm going to give my screen back to the studio. And Haley, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Dr. Shanahan. Could you comment on Lucy Calkin's acknowledgement that decoding is a necessary part of beginning reading instruction and the science of reading that includes this in research, especially in the National Reading Report?
Wonderful that she's come up to the 19th century. I'm happy that she's done it. Obviously I'm being a little facetious, and the reason I'm being facetious is there have been times in the past when Dr. Calkins has indicated that she's making some kind of a change or has come to some kind of a new insight, and it hasn't exactly happened, or it hasn't happened in a way that would really be consistent with the research. So I'm skeptical but hopeful. She is certainly someone who has developed a program that's used widely, and so if even half the people who use that program were to listen to her and start to make some of the kinds of changes that maybe that a change of thinking suggests, that would be terrific for boys and girls across the country. But I'm going to have to wait until I actually see it. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Here's another. What is your opinion on apps like Learning Alley? Do they support your comment on getting students to their frustration level to achieve reading gains?
I don't know that program, so I'm not going to say anything about it one way or the other. But I definitely would suggest to you that either technology-based programs, which could do this, quite easily, could give kids text. Technology now, most of the technology program place kids at their instructional level. They could easily put kids a year or two above and start trying to identify, supports that could help the kids to handle that text. But as I've been showing, you can actually do these things without technology in regular classrooms. I would say when you're buying a program to teach reading comprehension or overall reading, comprehensive reading, I would look for programs that are going to facilitate and support my providing kids with text at their grade level. Can I just add one little thing, and that is, please don't misunderstand that every single text kids read for instruction has to be at at grade level, or just, it was the instructional level people who kind of wanted this consistency of text. I think kids should be reading a lot in school, including kids who are dyslexic. And I think they should be reading a range of texts that are frankly easy for them, texts that they have to work hard at, and texts that frankly they're not going to make sense of without the help of a teacher. I think they need all of those experiences throughout their school days, their school weeks, and certainly across their school years. So we're not looking for a program that's just going to be hard for everybody. We're looking for a program that's going to make sure that there's enough of that challenging text and then enough support so the boys and girls can actually read it successfully.
What is one thing you wish all reading teachers would understand and put into practice?
I'm going to go with something really general. I wish all reading teachers knew more about research and why it's so important that we limit ourselves. We not just do whatever we feel like in a classroom, but we limit ourselves to things that have actually been found to give real benefits to kids. And that's especially important if you're working with kids who are disadvantaged, by poverty and racism and things like that. It's important if kids have disabilities in this area. It's important for whatever reason some of the boys and girls might not be doing well, that we do the things that have the highest chance of success, and not just, we just sort of do anything, or we do whatever we was done with us when we were kids. So I wish teachers were better trained in research. I wish we were doing a better job of interpreting and getting research information out. Maybe we wouldn't see as many purchases of programs that really don't make sense in terms of the science of reading.
Thank you. And we have just about 5 more minutes, but here's another question. What is the most interesting piece of literacy research to come out in the past few years, in your opinion?
Well, to me, I think, the most interesting stuff really has to do with this, these ideas that I was just sharing with you now. The reason why I think they're so exciting is because they are unlike any of the other things I can think of that are terrific pieces of research. They're not finding something that's been widely known or practiced. You see, there's wonderful work being done on teaching phonemic awareness and phonics. There's wonderful research being done on teaching oral reading fluency. And all of that research is very, very consistent with, say, the research that I helped summarize and make sense of in the National Reading Panel report 20 years ago. People aren't finding dramatically new things, say, about decoding. They might be finding, hey, that helps this group too, or you can teach that to these kids that weren't in the original studies. And that's not bad. That's useful, research, but it doesn't change what I would do in most classrooms. It just confirms. Not a bad thing, but it confirming what I'm already doing isn't as helpful as pointing out something that I didn't even think was possible, right? I had no idea we could do. It was treated as fact. It was treated as scripture, in our field, almost a religious connotation to it. And yet, when you actually look at the studies on it, you find, hey, this really works for kids. And as we've been trying it out in classrooms and doing it with kids, and I get mail almost every day from teachers, people saying, wow, I did it the other way for years. I didn't know my kids could learn from this. I didn't know that, and they like it. And it actually, and so I just think that's the most exciting thing. But, there's usually what people find is whatever they're working on to be most exciting. And maybe there's a bit of that in what I'm telling you, though I haven't actually done any of the studies I shared with you. So maybe it isn't just my own interest. I just think those things that we aren't doing with kids that we need to, if research will point those out, that's most important, or that's most exciting.
Thank you. And one more question for you. How do you respond to critics of the science of reading?
Well, I actually don't find many critics of the science of reading. What I find is people claiming support from the science of reading when it isn't really there. And so, someone like Lucy Calkin, since the questions raised her before, and she's not unique, so I'm not picking on her particularly, but when folks were criticizing her program for things like not having, putting kids in text that was complex enough, or not teaching phonics and those kinds of things, she responded that, people like Tim Shanahan didn't own the science of reading, and what she was doing was scientific too, because, somebody had, because of Emmett Bett's study, she cited that, which is pretty funny since he didn't do the research. That's kind of what's going on with it. I don't know that there's a single person out there who would say, oh, I'm against the science of reading. What the arguments are about is which science of reading and what constitutes the studies. And what I would suggest to everybody, I just published an article on this in Reading Research Quarterly. If you have access to that, you might want to take a look. I'm suggesting that not that we ignore the brain research or all the incredibly important correlational studies or things that Emily Hanford and has cited in her wonderful radio programs and so on. I'm not suggesting ignoring those, but I'm suggesting that the things that we should be bringing into our classrooms should have been tried out, that we should have evidence that they actually confer an advantage to children. So if you have a picture of the brain that shows that we process words in a particular part of the brain, and therefore scientists believe that's why phonics is helping, that's not a good reason to teach phonics. The reason to teach good phonics is that there are more than 50 studies out there where people have tried this out in classrooms, and the kids learn more than the kids who aren't being taught that. That's the sheer test. And so to me, the science of reading, or more properly, the science of reading instruction, is a science that, yeah, it pays attention to the ideas that you get from those correlational studies and those descriptive studies and those brain studies. But whatever it comes up with, it actually tests against real children's learning. And if it advantages that learning, it belongs in our classes. And if it doesn't, well, maybe someday someone will figure out how it could, but until they do, it shouldn't be there. So when someone's talking about science of reading, make sure that they're actually talking about that, not just any kind of study that they think is relevant to teaching. They really have to try it out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanahan, for speaking with us today. And that concludes our seminar.
I just lost my glasses. Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you, Neuhaus, for putting this on,
Thank
and
you
for
again
all of you for joining
to
us.
today's sponsor and our incredible educators who have been present today. We are so grateful to all of you.